Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Do the election results represent a tectonic shift in Indian politics? How serious a setback are they for Narendra Modi? And what sort of Prime Minister is he likely to be the third time round? Those are three critical issues that I shall raise today with someone who's widely regarded the most profound commentator on Indian politics. Former President of the Centre for Policy Research and former Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Mr. Mehta, let me start with a general question. How do you view the overall election result? Narendra Modi has led his party to its worst result in 10 years. The party has lost its majority. It can't form a government without allies. Is this a tectonic shift in Indian politics, or would that be an exaggerated conclusion?
I think the best way of characterizing it is that it has prevented the consolidation of a tectonic shift that was taking place over the last 10 years. So think of the counterfactual. If he had won with a bigger majority, you would have had a one party, one ideology and one leader rule consolidated, which would have spelt grave danger for Indian democracy. So I think the very least we can say it's tectonic in the sense that it has avoided an outcome towards which we looked like we were heading, and which would have been actually quite it would have been a different kind of republic. So in that sense, I think it's a tectonic shift. It's also, I think, a tectonic shift in the sense that for the last 10 years, we have been used to the dominance of Narendra Modi as a figure in Indian politics, commanding unparalleled authority. And I think this election signals a pricking of the bubble of his authority, which is, I think, quite significant in the Indian context. But it also a reversal to the mean, which is, by that I mean, we are reverting back to the kinds of politics we had prior to Narendra Modi, particularly prior to 2019, 2014, a politics that will require a lot more coalition building, a politics where the social bases of different parties are much more fluid, and therefore a lot more uncertain.
A pricking of the bubble of the authority of Narendra Modi. Let me pursue that thought a little further. Modi boasted in Parliament that the BJP would get 370 seats. He said the NDA, his allies, would cross 400. He's ended up with just 240. And if Chandrababu Naidu and Nitish Kumar, who aren't famous for their loyalty as allies, desert him, his government will fall apart. How seriously has that bubble of authority been pricked? How serious a setback is this for Narendra Modi?
It is an incredibly serious setback because the election was largely about him, and he made it about himself, right? In fact, I think even the election schedule was arranged so that he could have the maximum number of rallies. As you have often pointed out, candidates in constituencies where he campaigned, 50% of those constituencies, candidates lost. So he's clearly not quite the single-handed vote getter for the BJP that they had assumed he was. A lot of the data coming out suggests that part of this election is a revolt against his hubris and his arrogance. And members of his own party, I think Rajasthan, the state party, had a session yesterday trying to analyze his defeat, and the sense that's coming out of that this is one of the reasons they're actually attributing, or one of the reasons why I think BJP did less well in Rajasthan than it would have. So he is being personally held responsible for this decline in the BJP's fortunes. And you can see it all around. I mean, the sense of fear that has lifted. He has gone from being the kind of leader who could do no wrong to the kind of leader who is now the object of open derision, jokes. We may not take them politically as seriously, but it does signify that he's been cut to size and is now just another ordinary politician.
How significantly has he been cut to size? Because that, I suppose, is the first intriguing consequence of the election outcome. You referred to the quint figure that 50% of the constituencies where he campaigned, the candidates he was campaigning for lost. India Today says that in Bengal, out of the 27 constituencies where Mr. Modi campaigned, 20 were lost by the BJP. And indeed, in his own constituency of Varanasi, this time compared to 2019, over 3 lakh people didn't vote for him. They did vote in earlier elections of 2019, they didn't this time around. So how significant is this weakening of the image? How significant is the diminishment of his appeal?
I think, Karan, there's a larger question behind that. I think the diminution in his stature is, I think, quite significant. And it's actually showing on his face, in his body language, quite visibly. If you recall, when he appeared at the so-called victory celebration. But I think there's a much larger question, I think, behind this defeat. Because Narendra Modi, yes, he's a powerful individual, and you don't get to dominate Indian politics for so long without some exceptional political gifts. But Narendra Modi was also a leader with an agenda. And the agenda had 2 legs, right? There was Hindutva, the consolidation of Hindu nationalism, which became embodied in his persona. He became its chief priest, its chief king, in a sense, its chief messenger. And it was also dependent upon creating what in his mind was a kind of welfare coalition, which is to say the creation of a range of government schemes that he thought would allow the BJP to incorporate new constituencies behind it. And to me, I think what this election signifies is it's an exhaustion of both of those strategies. It's not a rejection of Hindutva. I don't think there is a rejection of the idea that the temple should have been consecrated at Ayodhya, but there is a sense of exhaustion about Hindutva. If you are a Hindu nationalist right now, you have difficulty answering the question, what next? What do we do with this ideology? Other than, in a sense, simply spouting hate for minorities or rallying it behind authoritarianism. So there's a kind of intellectual and ideological exhaustion on that front. And I think there's a kind of exhaustion on Mr. Modi's governance credentials. He didn't do as badly as the opposition sometimes claims. The economy's performance has been mostly middling. But 10 years in power, I think, has beginning to convince voters that Mr. Modi may have done a few good things. Capital investment in infrastructure may be high. But he has certainly not brought about the kind of structural reform of the economy that voters want. So I think the deeper crisis for him is not sort of whether it's a personal rebuke to Mr. Modi. It is that both he and the BJP are going to be a little bit at a loss to think about where do they go next. And I think that's the real question.
You're suggesting they're running out of momentum, they're running out of things to do, they're running out of ways to appeal to people.
Absolutely, they are running out of ideas, and they're running out of credibility also, because after 10 years, you have to run on your performance, not on promissory notes.
And that performance is now beginning to look not as glorious as it did 6-7 years ago.
Yes, not as glorious as it is. And I think at the margins, people are probably more convinced that the difference between them and the opposition is much less on governance issues than they might have imagined 5 or 6 years ago.
Now, one of the things the Prime Minister did do was to launch perhaps the most communal campaign we've seen in recent times.
Right.
He called Muslims infiltrators. He said they have more children than the rest of us. He repeatedly said that Muslims would be beneficiaries of reservations snatched from OBCs, STs and SCs. But in the end, compared to 2019, the BJP ended up losing 63 seats. Its vote share fell by almost 1%. And even in the prestigious constituency of Ayodhya, where the temple has been built, the BJP failed to win. Is there a message here from the Indian people about communal campaigns and communal rhetoric?
I must confess, I am ambivalent about what we can read from this election. Certainly there is a message. I mean, obviously that communal campaigns on their own don't work. If that's the only thing or the most important thing you're offering voters, I think they will actually turn away from it. I do happen to think that the communalization of particularly elite sections of Indian society still remains quite significant. And I don't think this is a vote against anything Mr. Modi has so far done in the name of communalism, like Ayodhya, like rewriting history books, the creating of a full structure of civil society that in a sense spreads communalism, the empowering of communal leaders, many members of his own cabinet. I think it's a little bit premature to conclude that this is a massive rejection of that strategy. I think what we can safely conclude is that even for Hindutva to rise, right, it has to actually rest upon a much larger package, right? People have to come to this conclusion that other things being equal, they trust Mr. Modi and the BJP to lead the country better than their rivals.
That doesn't exist.
And that doesn't unequivocally exist, exist anymore.
So, communalism, could we agree on this, didn't yield the results that Mr. Modi thought it would. Those dog whistle appeals, those claims that Muslims are infiltrators, and he was calling his fellow citizens, he was calling 200 million people infiltrators, that didn't yield the results that he was hoping for. It may not be a rejection of communalism from the Indian people, but it certainly isn't an affirmation of it either.
It's not an affirmation of communalism, and I think it does give you some indication that the question with communalism, I think there is a lot more tolerance for communalism, and one of the interesting things about this election is that even a lot of opposition parties and Mr. Modi's allies don't want to take him frontally on the communal issue.
Because they're worried.
Except Rahul Gandhi, who does, but I think they in a sense try to throw cold water in that issue or shy away from it, which to me suggests that they're also still afraid of frontally confronting him, I think on that issue. But I think it does raise this interesting question: when does communal rhetoric reach a level that it begins to be a deal breaker for voters, where they begin to say, look, we are happy to tolerate or perhaps even go along with a certain level of communalism, but there is a limit to how much you can use it, and certainly there's a limit to how much you can use it for your own personal aggrandizement. I think the chastisement Mr. Modi is getting is for using the Ram temple for his personal aggrandizement. And also the fact, I think one other significant feature of his election campaign this time is on the economic front, there was nothing new to offer. He did use the Vikasit Bharat 2047 slogan, right? But most of his campaigns, if you actually watch his speeches closely, is really running on the capital of schemes that he supposedly fulfilled 5 years ago, 7 years ago, right? I don't think voters saw anything new in that economic governance architecture.
And communalism wasn't enough to fill the gap.
And communalism alone wasn't enough to fill the gap, particularly because I think in places like Ayodhya, the sense that he was using it for his own personal aggrandizement.
Let's, against this background, come to some of the comments that Sangsak Chalak of the RSS, the chief of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, made last Monday. First, he spoke about how India treats different communities, including minorities. He said, and I'm quoting him, "We must respect diversity, live together, respect others." He added, "We must embrace goodwill to all." And then, perhaps most pointedly, he said, "We must treat the sons of our country as brothers." Was he there subtly but cleverly saying Muslims are brothers, not infiltrators? Was this a dig at Mr. Modi for his comment?
I'm not convinced it was a dig at Mr. Modi for Mr. Modi's communalism. And for one simple reason. I think with the RSS, one has to adopt two rules. One, look at what they do, not what they say. And second, the question has never been at a 30,000 feet metaphysical level, are we brothers? I mean, it's easy to say that. There is a very specific social contract in modern India in terms of which that brotherhood has to be cashed out. That specific social contract is, do you protect every single individual's rights? Do you object to politicians who dog whistle and spread hate? Is your version of Indian history one that actually systematically marginalizes a particular community. And I think if the RSS really believes in that brotherhood, it should stand for equal individual freedom for all. It should come out clean on what its version of Indian civilization and Indian culture is, and just talk much more directly. I think this kind of positioning where it forces us to read between the lines and hold on to straws, I suspect is a little bit of a diversion.
Okay, let me put something else to you. Many people interpreted parts of Mr. Bhagwat's speech as almost directly being addressed to the Prime Minister, although at no point of time did Mr. Bhagwat name Mr. Modi. This was when Mr. Bhagwat said, "A true sevak does not have ahankar or arrogance." Again, he said, and I'm now quoting from the English version of his speech, he said, "Only he who practices karma but does so selflessly without ego deserves to be called a true sevak." Do you think, as many have interpreted, that Mr. Bhagwat had the huge personality cult built up around Mr. Modi in mind? That maybe Mr. Bhagwat was even alluding to the fact that Mr. Modi claims he's not of biological birth?
I have a slightly different reading of this. So it was directed at Mr. Modi, and it clearly is pointing to Mr. Modi's extraordinary egotism, which is his, one of the big sources of his vulnerability. But I think the reason Mr. Bhagwat is saying this is the following. Look, Mr. Bhagwat had no objections riding on Mr. Modi's popularity, right? In fact, the RSS grew and the Hindutva agenda grew in part because Mr. Modi became popular. I think what is happening here right now is that as they see Mr. Modi's stock falling politically, they are trying to distance themselves from Mr. Modi a little bit so that the purity of the ideology can actually be rescued from whatever charges are hurled against Mr. Modi. You know, right, that old saying about the French Revolution, but the church and state were tied. When people got mad at the state, they also got mad at the church because the two were very closely tied. And I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to rescue Hindutva from whatever anger people might at some point express against Mr. Modi. So I think this is a salvaging of the ideology operation as much as it is a cutting down of Mr. Modi to size.
So was this in any sense an admonition of Mr. Modi's egoism?
That I think is very clear. I think it was, but I think it is an opportunistic. I don't think if Mr. Modi had won, they would not have had accused him of egotism. I think that's the difference.
So this is self-protection rather than...
This is self-protection, I think.
But the interesting thing is that Mr. Bhagwat chose to make his comments publicly.
Right.
He didn't speak privately. He didn't drop in at Lok Kalyan Bhavan to have a quiet word. Right. He actually spoke publicly, and I assume that means he wanted the country to know and to hear what he was saying. And secondly, he wasn't the only RSS's senior leader who spoke out in this way. Indresh Kumar did. Indresh Kumar actually said the vote and the power that they should have been given was stopped by God due to their arrogance. And then there was Ratan Sharda, who wrote a stinging critique in Organizer. The fact that this was done publicly, the fact that there were at least 3 people from the RSS doing it, does that suggest that there was a sort of conscious collective message being sent?
No, there is a message being sent, I think the purpose of the message is to, in a sense, rescue the Hindutva ideology from the particular individual or its identification with the persona of Narendra Modi. But as I said, I think the important thing is that it's opportunistic. When you see a ship going down, if you actually make objections at that point...
These are rats jumping from a sinking ship.
These are rats, the ideological rats trying to rescue, jump the ship. I don't think there's a serious moral intent behind it.
But has a gap as a result opened up between the RSS and Mr. Modi? Because he certainly won't like what they've said and done.
Oh, I think there is a gap that has opened up between Mr. Modi and the RSS. But I think we sometimes focus a little bit too much on the personalities of both Mr. Modi and or Mr. Bhagwat. I think the BJP now is going to be in a deep structural dilemma. I mean, the question it will need to ask is, what is the lesson that it takes from this election? One lesson it might take is that Mr. Modi, in a sense, exceeded his remit. He acted egotistically. He made the party himself. He made the nation himself. That's one obvious lesson everybody else is taking. But the interesting question is, what else do they conclude? Does the RSS conclude from this election that it needs to scale back on Hindutva, that it needs to actually not just question Mr. Modi's egotism, but it also needs to question the daily practice of authoritarianism, the arrest of opposition leaders, the clamping down of civil society, the curbing of civil liberties? Is that the lesson the RSS is actually going to take from this?
What's your answer to that question?
I don't think it is going to take that lesson. I actually think focusing on Mr. Modi is giving it the easy way out rather than reflecting on its own contribution to actually producing this phenomenon and the authoritarianism and communalism that it represented.
So not only is this self-protection, but they're also targeting Modi and making him the object of blame because they want to avoid, perhaps consciously avoid, going into the other deeper, more troublesome questions that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, for Mr. Mohit Bhagwat, the question is simple. Just come out protecting anybody whose civil liberties endangered, and you will have a much deeper basis for brotherhood in the country than talking about, Hindu-Muslim relations.
Which is something he's not prepared to do.
Which is something he's not prepared
So you're
to do.
also pointing out what's the right word for it, almost hypocritical-like attitude that the RSS has. Criticize Modi if you want, but stick to Mr. Modi. Don't go into the deeper issues behind it, because that would affect our own ideology and our own thinking, and that we're not prepared to do.
Yes, it is, or even if it's not hypocritical, at least it's a diversionary tactic. It focuses on the wrong object.
Let's at this point, Mr. Mehta, talk a little about the key election results before I come and talk to you about how you see the future. Right. The BJP was hoping to increase its tally of 62 seats in UP to somewhere over 70. It ended up with just 33, losing 29. It's also lost 11 seats in Rajasthan, 5 in Haryana, 3 in Jharkhand. And as you know, these are critical Hindi heartland states which the party considers its stronghold. What went so, I should say, almost massively wrong there?
As you know, Karan, when things go wrong, there are lots of different explanations. And at one level, the short answer is everything. But to me, I think the most critical thing, we've already talked about some of the issues, Mr. Modi's ill-judged speeches, I think candidate selection, when BJP took over so many turncoats from opposition parties and gave them tickets. It actually alienated even its own base. Because the distinctiveness of the party was in a sense diluted. In states like Maharashtra, of course, as you know, famously the extent of opportunism and impatience has alienated even some of its own constituencies. So there are a lot of those tactical mistakes I think they've made. But I think there is an interesting structural issue here, which is, I'll go back to the economic transformation point. So in this election, you see two phenomena. The BJP has not done well in the Hindi heartland. But there are these other interesting states, Orissa, Andhra, Telangana, where the BJP has made more inroads, right? Where, in a sense, it's on the ascendant. Now, one way of reading those two sets of results together is to say the following, that, and what is interesting about Orissa and Andhra in particular is these are two states where the incumbent parties had done a remarkable job creating a welfare coalition. Andhra Pradesh does lots of cash transfers. Orissa, Naveen Patnaik famously has created a fairly effective welfare state. So one way of reading the results is the following, that every government in India tries to create a social coalition using welfare schemes and does reasonably well for about a term or two. There is something they're offering voters that is important to them. But they then run into this brick wall of the structural transformation of the Indian economy, namely the Indian economy simply not producing enough high-wage jobs, consumption is not rising, and average wages have been relatively stagnant. And you can get credit for schemes for one election, two election, but at some point the obdurate reality of the Indian economy comes back to haunt you. So one way of thinking about this result is wherever BJP is on opposition, as it were, or has been out of power, people are willing to look at it as an alternative and give it a chance. wherever it has been an ascendant for almost a decade,
it suffered.
People are now holding it actually responsible. So I think there's a lesson in this for the opposition parties as well.
I'm sure what you're saying is very true and very accurate, but to what extent does it apply to that other state where the BJP suffered badly, Maharashtra?
Yeah.
Maharashtra, they had something like 23 seats. They're reduced to just 9. With their allies, they have only 18. And the India bloc has shot up to 29. Most people thought that Maharashtra was going to be very firmly within Mr Modi's grasp when he first began to break the Shiv Sena and then he broke the NCP. Was the message from Maharashtra partly to do with what you call the obdurate reality of the Indian economy, or was it also to do with the fact that the Maharashtrians looked at what was happening to their parties, looked at the opportunism and the amorality of it and said, we don't like this. This is not the sort of people we are.
I think it's both. I mean, particularly parts of Maharashtra like Vidarbha, rural Maharashtra have in a sense been resistant to some of, I think, the BJP's kind of outreach. But I agree with you. I think in Maharashtra, the brazenness with which the BJP acted, even opportunism has to be subtle. The brazenness, I think, embarrassed even their own constituents. It's very hard even for BJP supporters in Maharashtra to go to the voters and defend what the BJP did with a straight face. Almost everybody I know in Maharashtra, actually, including BJP supporters, feels very strongly that the way in which BJP broke the governments, the kind of horse trading it engaged in, it literally had no moral ground of any kind to stand on, and not even one out of which they could create a fig leaf. So I think you're absolutely right that the brazenness of that governance alienated lots of voters, including its own base.
So they touched a moral chord in Maharashtra without realizing they were doing so.
Absolutely. I mean, the sense of hubris that there are simply no limits to what kinds of means and instruments you can deploy in the making and breaking of governments. I think, it alienated voters.
Briefly, let's come to two areas where the BJP did considerably better than most people initially thought they would do. The first, of course, is Orissa. You mentioned it a moment ago. But not only has the BJP terminated Naveen Patnaik's 24-year tenure as chief minister, but it's also denied him even one seat in the Lok Sabha. And he lost one out of the two seats that he was fighting for at the Vidhan Sabha level. I mean, that is perhaps a more comprehensive result than even the BJP would have thought possible. What do you think explains it? Was it just that they were tired with Naveen and that they wanted a change? Or was it his age? Or was it this question of Pandyan and Uriya Ashmita? Or was it a combination of all of them?
I honestly am not in a position to judge how much of the Uriya Ashmita and the Pandyan story played, I think, how much of a role that played. I certainly think Mr. Patnaik's age was an issue, which is that at some point the ruling establishment sometimes lets off this vibe that it's kind of lost the will to fight and the will to rule. And big changes happen that way, right? When CPM transited to Mamata that way. And so my own sense is that I think it was a kind of exhaustion and a worry that post Naveen Patnaik, whether the BJD would be able to provide exactly the kind of governance that it did under him. So I think it's more that exhaustion and worry about him than necessarily a kind of affirmative vote for the BJP.
You also mentioned South India.
Right.
Not only has the BJP won seats in states like Kerala, Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka, but its vote share has gone up very appreciably even in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Telangana. Is there a real credible sense in which the doors of South India, which people always assumed were shut or at least partially shut, have now opened to the BJP?
So I've always believed that the doors of South India are actually open to the BJP in the sense that the cultural conditions for Hindutva to take hold are actually quite powerful in states including states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, right? What the BJP always had to contend it was that those states had pretty good established two-party systems, and it was very hard to translate that kind of cultural discourse of communalism and Hindutva into electoral gains. I, for a moment, don't believe that Kerala and Tamil Nadu are actually any less prone ideologically to communalism than large parts of North India. We used to think that about Karnataka 20 years ago, remember, and then Karnataka fell. So I think the cultural conditions are there. I think now what's opening up, particularly kind of post the AIDMK's kind of transition, is political spaces opening up. But I think the BJP is disappointed, I think, about its results in Tamil Nadu, because they actually thought that the AIADMK's decline would be faster, giving them, I think, a much greater oppositional space. But yes, they certainly have a bridgehead on which to build on.
Is there a danger that as they build on that bridgehead and enter Tamil Nadu more firmly, enter Kerala more firmly, they may have to dilute some of the things that give them an appeal in the north? Hindutva, for instance, or the stress on Hindi, or the stress on Hindu culture. Is there a danger that they may have to transform into a different party to make that crossing into the center and core of Tamil Nadu?
I certainly think they'll have to drop the stress on Hindi. And that, I think, is non-negotiable for any political. And to be honest, I don't think that's something that's actually very central to the BJP's imagination. I think Hindi as a kind of opposition to English works in North India. But I think one nation, one language, even they know is not on the cards. And frankly, that's not even the RSS culture. Actually, RSS trains its cadres to learn local languages. I actually don't think it'll get them to moderate their communalism. In fact, like in Karnataka, when they created a bridgehead in coastal areas like Mangalore, and as we are seeing even now with the Congress government in power in Karnataka, their strategy is still going to continue to be more communal polarization, because that is the basis on which they are trying to actually open up a political space. So yes, the dilution of Hindi, absolutely. Dilution of communalism, I'm very skeptical that they'll dilute communalism.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Let's briefly, before we end, look to the future. I know it's very difficult to do, but let me put 3 or 4 critical questions to you to see how you respond. For 10 years as Prime Minister in Delhi, for 12 before that as Chief Minister in Gujarat, Mr Modi had an absolute majority. He could do what he wanted to, and usually he did. Now he has to head a coalition government. He has to worry about the demands and conditions set by his allies. He has to frequently give in to them, even if his instinct is not to do so. Can he temperamentally and psychologically become someone who can run a coalition government? Has he got it in him to transform from Modi 1 into Modi 2?
So look, again, you don't get to be this powerful without political skills. And remember, one thing you could give him credit for retrospectively is actually sealing the alliance with Chandrababu Naidu and Nitish Kumar before the elections, right? They walked into an alliance with him eyes wide open into what they were getting, right? So I actually don't think there is anything that prevents him from being able to negotiate with him. And just like he kissed the Constitution, I'm sure he's quite capable of, cozying up to his allies. I think the problem for him is going to be deeper than his personality, which is there are going to be structural contradictions between the allies and the BJP that any leader in the BJP, even if it weren't Narendra Modi, if it were whoever, Vajpayee, Nitin Gadkari, anybody, will find it now difficult to negotiate. The principal one, which we will see in the next few months, is the place of caste in Indian politics. As you know, Patna High Court has just struck down Bihar government's extension of reservation. Nitish Kumar will all likely demand that this be put under the 9th schedule. He is, in all likelihood, will be pressurized by his social base in Bihar to insist on a caste census. Now, that is an issue that Mr. Modi has made so fundamental to his political identity. I mean, he ran the campaign on the issue of caste census.
This could be a breaking point.
That this could actually be a point of social conflict. And frankly, not just for Mr. Modi. I think the question this election has raised is that the BJP will now have to go back to first principles and actually will have to articulate clearly what principles and ideology it actually stands for. And I think that structural contradiction between them and the allies is going to be much deeper. I don't think it's a question about his personality.
So Mr. Modi's personality is not an obstacle to being the leader of a coalition, but the structural problems between what the allies will want and demand and what Mr. Modi can concede or will absolutely have to refuse to concede are the real potential breaking points.
Absolutely, and particularly I think in the case of JDU.
Let me try another one with you. For 20 years or more, Narendra Modi has littered his speeches with anti-Muslim rhetoric, starting with baby producing factories in 2002 up to this April when he called every one of India's Muslims infiltrators. He's also said that they will snatch reservations from OBCs, SCs and STs. Now, I presume this sort of rhetoric will be an anathema to the TDP and to JDU. They have Muslim constituents whose opinion and whose affection they care about. Nara Lokesh, who's now HRD minister in Andhra Pradesh, has gone on record in several interviews to say that the TDP has no intention of scrapping reservations for Muslims in Andhra. But can Mr. Modi suddenly change his Muslim language and rhetoric? Or is it something that's become second nature to him?
See, so two things. One, I'm actually not convinced that his language on Muslims is going to be the source of the breaking point between JDU and TDP and him. As I said, they walked into this alliance with eyes wide open. They know Mr. Modi's record.
And they stayed with him when he was at his worst.
And actually they stayed with him. So I don't think that's going to be, in sense a breaking point. The problem again here is not going to be just Mr. Modi. There is a structural issue, which is he has and the BJP has empowered a whole range of ministers, a very wide infrastructure in civil society that autonomously generates anti-Muslim rhetoric day in and day out, to the point where it has actually communalized large sections of Indian society. People don't even rent apartments to Muslims, even in this case recently of a housing society expelling one Muslim member. Now, once you have institutionalized communalism this much, it's not easy to put back the genie in the bottle. Mr. Modi, I don't think is the issue. I don't think it's going to be very difficult for him not to say this for the next year or two. There are a couple of elections coming up. He can again go back to speaking in metaphysical abstractions about brotherhood and Vishwaguru and all of that. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's very easy for him to do it, right? He's a master actor that way. But the issue is going to be that the base of the party and the structures it has empowered, these are not going to be that easy to contain. Even within a week after the election, if you watch civil society discourse, right? There's no scaling back on anti-Muslim rhetoric. So I think this is an existential question for the BJP as much as it is for Mr. Modi.
But it is also then an existential question for the sort of country we've become.
Absolutely. It's an existential question for the sort of country we have become. And the one big takeaway from this election, right, going back to your question, is it a tectonic shift? This is an election that ideally should force the BJP in particular to ask some fundamental questions about what direction does it want to take the party in, and what kind of nation does it want to build? That's also a question for Mr. Bhagwat, by the way.
Absolutely.
I think
but just as Mr. Bhagwat's unlikely to ask himself that
yeah.
question, do you believe Mr. Modi will be asking this question?
No, Mr. Modi will not ask this question, and here's the reason why I'm a little bit pessimistic about it, which is his base will not let him. But more importantly, having exhausted the governance and welfare card on which he ran for the last 10 years, having exhausted a phase of Hindutva consolidation, the Ram temple has been built, done and dusted. Where do we go now? He is going to be at an intellectual and political loss for what is the next move in my strategy. Now, what India needs is deep structural reform to create an inclusive and participatory economy. But that kind of reform requires lots of patient governance. It doesn't require big bang announcements. You don't want lots of fast Vande Bharat trains. You want attention to detail in safety. That is something Mr. Modi is not capable of doing in terms of his governance style.
And his instinct as well.
And his instinct. And so the only instrument that he will have for political mobilization will, I fear, be to return to some of the insidious communal mobilization, because he's run out of ideas elsewhere.
And it's the safest thing, it's the best tried method for him.
Or it's the only method he knows, enduringly.
So the dismal and depressing truth is Mr. Modi can learn and teach and quite easily even act his way into curbing his anti-Muslim rhetoric. But as you said, the genie is out of the bottle, and the genie is not going to creep back in quietly. It's going to have to be physically pushed back in, and that doesn't look as if it's going to happen.
Absolutely, and they don't have an incentive to, as you said.
What about Mr. Modi's attitude to institutions like Parliament, the judiciary and the media? He's habitually ignored Parliament. He's frequently held up judicial appointments recommended by the collegium. He's been dismissive of the media. Now that he's, at least apparently and initially, a weaker prime minister who needs to be consensual in his approach, is he likely to be?
So, the relationship between government and media and government and independent institutions is half a story of Mr. Modi, but it's also, as you very well know, half a story of us capitulating too easily, right? And sometimes out of genuine ideological conviction. We actually sometimes underestimate the degree to which the Indian elite was quite comfortable with Mr. Modi's agenda. I actually don't think Mr. Modi is going to change his ways. And again, this week has already given you evidence. If you're filing UAPA charges against Arundhati Roy, certainly not a good signal to begin with. And again, because that's the kind of governance style that you have created, right? I think the more interesting question is, now that we have a more competitive political landscape, do those people who were not ideological fellow travelers and caving it out of fear, are they willing to take a few more risks to stand up for the integrity of their professions? This applies to the judiciary. This applies to the media. Now, one would hope that given a more competitive political landscape, if nothing else, it would be prudent for independent institutions to not act as if Mr. Modi is going to rule forever, right? And if there is a source of hope, it's actually going to lie in the courage of those independent institutions, media organizations, and civil society to finally say, look, we had reason to be afraid, but perhaps we should not exaggerate the kind of hold Mr. Modi has on India.
It's 12 days almost since Mr. Modi was sworn in a third time. Have Indian institutions, have the Indian middle classes, have the Indian intellectual elite found their spine?
I think it's too early to tell. I mean, honestly, 12 days is too short a time.
You mean to say they're still looking for it?
No, it has to be tested, right? I mean, I think right now, certainly, I think criticism of Mr. Modi is much more vocal than was the case probably 2 months ago. And it is interesting to see how many people are retrospectively changing their positions. You could read a couple of judicial decisions as instances of the judiciary finding its spine, particularly during the period of election. I think a judgment on the kind of threshold the state has to satisfy to give sanctions against under PMLRS. So there are small green shoots, but I think it's still too early to say, particularly in the media, where in the television media, I actually don't quite see that sort of push back against Mr. Modi quite as much as you'd hope.
But television channels are still exactly the way they were the day before the results came out.
Absolutely. And that suggests there's a deeper complicity than simply Mr. Modi's actions.
My last question, and I'll flip it around this time. Do you see any change in Mr. Modi's attitude to criticism and dissent now that he's seen he's not as powerful, not as strong as he used to be? Do you think his misuse or alleged misuse of the ED and the CBI will cease or at least diminish? Do you think journalists and opposition politicians have as much to fear of him in his third term as they did in the first and the second? In other words, will his attitude alter?
I'm very skeptical that it will, for two reasons. One, of course, it depends on how he diagnoses the setback. My fear is that they will diagnose it in tactical terms, not in terms of the fundamentals of what they did. Oh, wrong ticket selection here, organizational weakness here and there, not in terms of that there was something fundamentally wrong with our authoritarianism and communalism. I think I think he's going to find it very hard to, I think accept that as a diagnosis. And if he doesn't accept that as a diagnosis, he's not, in a sense, going to change. The second reason is, and this is, I think, where we are heading, with an opposition emboldened and assuming the opposition manages to stick together, which I think they will for at least a while. I think there's good incentive to. He is now faced with a situation where he's going to have to encounter not just greater opposition in parliament, but potentially also greater street protest. I think the NEET issue, for example, has already brought out students on the streets. It's given 3 million young people their first taste of bad BJP governance in some ways. And I think faced with that mobilizational challenge, their instinct is going to be to retreat into some kind of discourse of law and order, which actually means more repression. And as you know, sometimes wounded tigers are actually very dangerous things. And I suspect he will act more like a wounded tiger.
Vengeful and vicious.
Vengeful and vicious. Than he will like a statesman who goes back to first principles and says, let me ask a fundamental question. What is this a vote for?
So he may have suffered an incredible setback, as you said right at the beginning, but the instinct of the wounded tiger will be to be vengeful and vicious rather than to be statesmanlike. In other words, we may not perceive very many meaningful, significant changes in the sort of prime minister ruling our country.
Or the changes may even be for the worse, because for him, the existential stakes in losing power are very, very large. And if he has run out of ideas, right, both in terms of Hindutva and an economic agenda, then the only way he can stay in power is through, in a sense, use intimidation and coercion.
Repression, coercion, more communalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
In other words, there are good reasons to be very worried about the future.
Yes, so Indian democracy has walked back from the brink, but it is still a dangerous moment in Indian democracy.
Pratap Bhanu Mehta, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.